If Ihanam is a city of secrets, a place where the very streets seem to whisper of old blood and older sins, then the Upper Cathedral Ward is its most closely guarded secret. It is the silent, marble heart of the city's mysteries, a place where the air grows thin and cold, and the cacophony of the beastly hunt fades into a profound, unnerving quiet. To speak of the choir is to speak of this silence. It is to pull back a velvet curtain of night and peer into a realm where humanity's most brilliant and desperate minds reached for the stars. And in doing so, cast long, terrible shadows that we are only now, in the quiet of this night, beginning to truly perceive. The story of the healing church is often told through its violence. We see it in the huntsmen cleansing the streets with fire and saw cleaver, in the pious zeal of the cathedral ward, and in the grotesque transformations that are its ultimate, damning legacy. But the choir represents a different aspect of the church entirely. They were not mere hunters or preachers, though they commanded both. They were the secret brains of the entire operation, the intellectual elite who operated from the highest, most isolated point in the city, far removed from the grime and the blood. They were the inheritors of Biogenworth's original, insatiable curiosity, but they possessed resources and a ruthlessness that their scholarly predecessors could never have imagined. Their quest was not simply for knowledge, but for evolution, for transcendence. They sought to force open the doors of human perception and commune directly with the cosmic truths that govern our reality. To understand the choir, we must first understand their environment. The Upper Cathedral Ward is not a place one simply walks into. It is a fortress of knowledge, accessible only by a single, specific key, a relic that feels more like a surgical instrument than a piece of architecture. This in itself is a statement of intent. The choir did not seek congregation. They did not welcome pilgrims. They erected barriers, both physical and intellectual, to ensure that only the chosen, only the truly enlightened could breach their sanctum. When you finally ascend to that high place, the world changes. The frantic, Gothic horror of Lower Ihanam gives way to something else, something colder and more despairing. The buildings are grand, crafted from pale, elegant stone, but they are scarred. Windows are shattered, not by mobs, but from the inside out. Ornate gates are twisted and torn from their hinges by forces that were not merely beastly. The very air is thick with a strange blue haze, a lingering mist that feels less like weather and more like a residue, the fading breath of something immense and utterly alien. And then there is the silence. It is a heavy, absorbing silence, broken only by the slow, determined clicking of your own footsteps on the marble floors, and by something else, a faint, wet, sucking sound from the darkness ahead, a sound that speaks of a terrible and irreversible change. This is the choir's legacy. The grandeur is a monument to their ambition. The destruction is the evidence of their failure, and the creatures that now shamble through the halls are the tragic, monstrous results of their forbidden work. They are the keepers of this empty palace, the final damning testament to the price of reaching too high. The choir in the present time of the hunt we experience is a ghost. Its members are almost entirely gone, transformed, or dead. We find their bodies in quiet, private studies, slumped over desks, as if they simply fell asleep mid-calculation. We find them in the darkest corners, their forms twisted into new, pathetic shapes. We find their notes, their scrawled, frantic writings that speak of breakthroughs and terrors in the same breath. To piece together their story is to become an archaeologist of a recently collapsed civilization, one that fell not to invasion or plague, but to the weight of its own impossible knowledge. They are the whispering voices in the static of the cosmos, and we are here in the quiet and the dark to listen. Their ideology was simple in its statement, but infinitely complex in its execution. They sought eyes on the inside, a phrase inherited from Master Willem of Biogenwith, but they pursued it with a radical, surgical fervor that he would have likely found abhorrent. Where Willem advocated for patience and meditation, for the slow, internal cultivation of insight, the choir believed in direct intervention. They sought to force the development of a new, internal organ of perception, to surgically and alchemically carve a new sense into the very substance of the human brain. They believed that the cosmos, a vast, breathing, thinking expanse of beings and energies beyond human comprehension, was not distant. It was here, all around us, pressing in on the fabric of our reality, and humanity was simply too blind, too limited to see it. The choir's goal was to cure this blindness, no matter the cost. This philosophy positioned them at the very apex of the healing church's power structure. They were the arbiters of truth, the interpreters of the divine will they claimed to channel from the great ones. They looked down, both literally and figuratively, upon the other branches of the church. They saw the hunters of the workshop as necessary brutes, a means to cull the unfortunate side effects of their communion with the old blood. They viewed the more mainstream clergy in the Cathedral Ward as useful idiots, pious administrators who could manage the flock without ever understanding the terrifying truths that gave their faith its power. And they saw the school of Mensis, their main rival within the church's upper echelons, as reckless, brutish heretics, whose methods were crude, violent, and doomed to failure. The choir believed in finesse, in precision, in a clean and intellectual assent. As we will see, their methods were anything but clean. The key to their entire operation, the foundational element that separated them from Biogenwith and propelled them into a new realm of possibility, was their relationship with a specific, tragic entity. Ebrietas, daughter of the cosmos. While the scholars of Biogenwith had only fragments, slivers of arcane knowledge, desiccated corpses from the tombs, and the tantalizing, incomplete teachings of Master Willem, the choir had a living, breathing source. They had a great one, a true celestial being, right there in their midst. This was not a theory or a scripture, it was a fact. It was a resource. And it was from Ebrietas, from her very blood and her alien consciousness, that the choir derived the power and the insight to attempt the unthinkable. They built their entire worldview, their science, and their religion around this single, captive god. As we prepare to delve deeper, to leave this overview and step into the specific, haunting chapters of their story, hold onto the atmosphere of this introduction. Hold onto the image of those silent, marble halls bathed in an unnatural blue light. Hold onto the feeling of profound isolation, of intellect divorced from empathy, of ambition untethered from morality. The choir sought to lift humanity to a higher plane of existence, to make us citizens of the cosmos. But in their quest to grant us eyes, they blinded themselves to the humanity they were meant to elevate. And in the end, all they left behind were whispers in the dark, and the terrible, lingering sounds of their beautiful, monstrous failures. The story of the choir does not begin in a laboratory or a grand cathedral, but in a place that, on the surface, speaks of charity and compassion, an orphanage. The Upper Cathedral Ward Orphanage stands as one of the most potent and chilling symbols of the healing church's duality. It was a place of shelter, a promise of safety for the lost and parentless children of Ihanam, a city increasingly plagued by a strange and bloody scourge. But like so much in Ihanam, this benevolent facade concealed a far darker, more calculated purpose. The orphanage was not merely a refuge, it was a farm. It was a cradle, meticulously designed not to nurture children into adulthood, but to cultivate them into the next generation of the church's most brilliant and cold-minded thinkers, the secret brains who would become the choir. To understand the significance of this, we must consider the context of Ihanam. The healing church, built upon the miracle of the old blood, attracted countless pilgrims seeking a cure for their ailments. Many of these people were sick, desperate, and alone. Many of them died, leaving behind children with nowhere to go. The church, in its apparent benevolence, took them in. It was a perfect, self-sustaining system. The church's central tenet, that the old blood was a panacea, created the very scourge that orphaned these children. And then the church, as the sole source of order and hope, gathered these young, impressionable minds into its care. It was a closed loop of cause and effect, of problem and solution, and it provided the church with its most valuable resource, human raw material. The orphanage, therefore, was the ultimate indoctrination center. From a young age, these children were removed from the conventional world. They were raised in an environment of intense, focused education, but an education skewed entirely toward the church's esoteric and dangerous goals. They would have been taught the history of biogenwith, the principles of the cosmos, the importance of insight, and the sacred goal of evolving humanity beyond its bestial limitations. Their entire reality was shaped and controlled, their worldview carefully constructed brick by brick, with the choir's ideology as the immutable foundation. They were not taught to question if the church's path was correct, but rather how to most efficiently walk it. They were being groomed to become the future leaders of this cosmic crusade, the purest products of the Church's own making, untainted by the outside world's doubts or sentimentalities. This process of grooming was not passive. It was an active and likely brutal process of selection. We can imagine the caregivers and tutors in the orphanage constantly observing the children, testing their intellect, their resilience, and perhaps even their latent psychic or arcane potential. The most promising, the most intellectually gifted, the most coldly logical would be singled out for advancement. They would be given access to deeper secrets, more complex theories, and eventually introduced to the practical work of the choir. The less gifted, or those who showed too much emotional weakness, would likely have been relegated to lesser roles within the Church's hierarchy. Or perhaps, in the darkest possibilities, they became part of the raw material for the choir's more direct experiments. The orphanage was a sorting mechanism, a filter designed to produce the perfect, dispassionate intellect. The physical location of the orphanage is also deeply significant. It was situated within the Upper Cathedral Ward itself, the most secure and isolated part of the city. This served multiple purposes. First, it ensured secrecy. The true nature of the children's education and fate was hidden from the prying eyes of the common Ehanamites below. Second, it instilled a sense of privilege and separation in the children. They were made to feel special, chosen, elevated above the chaotic, beast-ridden streets. They lived in the rarefied air of the elite, looking down upon the city they were destined to guide and transform. This cultivated an innate sense of superiority and detachment, crucial for minds that would later be asked to perform horrific experiments in the name of a grand, cosmic goal. Empathy for the common man was a liability they could not afford. The most direct and heartbreaking evidence of the orphanage's true purpose is found in the game itself, in the form of a single, profoundly disturbing key item. The orphanage key. Its description does not mince words. It states, and I am paraphrasing here, that the orphanage was the starting point of the choir, and that the children who grew up there were, quote, silk-thin heads destined to become the secret brains of the healing church. The phrase silk-thin heads is hauntingly ambiguous. It could be a metaphor for their refined, delicate intellects, minds honed to a fine, sharp point. But in the visceral, physical world of Bloodborne, it is impossible to ignore a more literal, more horrifying interpretation. It suggests a physical alteration, a thinning or refining of the very skull, perhaps to make the brain more susceptible to cosmic influences, or to prepare it for the surgical implantation of eyes. This key is not just a tool. It is a testament, a small, cold piece of metal that unlocks not just a door, but the terrible truth of the choir's origins. Furthermore, the legacy of the orphanage is written on the very bodies of the choir's most infamous creations. The celestial children, also known as the Celestial Emissaries. These small, blue, childlike creatures, with their oversized heads and simple, almost innocent demeanor, are a grotesque echo of the orphanage's inhabitants. Their childlike proportions are not a coincidence. They are the tragic end result of the choir's experiments on the very children they swore to protect. These were the orphans, subjected to the choir's most radical procedures in an attempt to force a connection to the cosmos. Their enlarged heads are a physical manifestation of the silk-thin heads, philosophy taken to its monstrous conclusion, a brain swollen and transformed by forced contact with alien knowledge. They are the ultimate perversion of the orphanage's purpose, not the cultivation of young minds, but the literal transmutation of young bodies into alien conduits. So, as we picture the Upper Cathedral Ward orphanage, we must hold two conflicting images in our minds simultaneously. We must see the clean, well-ordered dormitories, the classrooms filled with eager young students learning of the cosmos, the quiet halls that offered shelter from the horrors of Ihanam. And we must also see the hidden laboratories, the selection process, the cold, calculating gaze of the tutors, and the final, tragic fate of so many of those children, transformed into blue, stumbling, simple-minded kin, forever trapped between humanity and the stars. The orphanage was the womb of the choir, and from this womb was born not just a new order of intellectuals, but a profound and lasting tragedy, one that would echo through the marble halls and eventually consume its creators in the silent, desperate hunger for eyes. The scholars who would become the choir were safe in their marble tower. Their young prodigies were being groomed in the orphanage, and the healing church's influence over Ihanam was absolute. But for true visionaries, power and security are not ends in themselves. They are merely tools for the pursuit of a greater truth. The choir possessed the resources of the church, the intellectual foundation of Biogenwith, and the ambition to reach beyond the known world. Yet they lacked a catalyst, a singular, paradigm-shifting discovery that would irrevocably set them on their own unique and terrifying path. That catalyst was not found in a book or a theory, but deep underground in the lightless, suffocating silence of the tomb labyrinths. It was the great Isz Chalice, and its discovery did not just give the choir new knowledge, it fundamentally rewired their understanding of reality itself. To appreciate the magnitude of this discovery, we must first understand the practice of tomb prospecting. The healing church, following in the footsteps of Biogenwith, never stopped exploring the ancient, non-human ruins that lay buried beneath Ihanam. These labyrinthine tombs were a source of immense danger and immense reward. Church-sanctioned prospectors, brave or foolhardy individuals, would descend into the dark with the goal of mapping the tunnels, battling the grotesque tomb dwellers, and most importantly, retrieving artifacts. They sought ritual materials, old bones, and the ultimate prize, chalices. These chalices were not mere cups. They were complex, arcane devices that acted as focal points, allowing one to perform rituals that could recreate entire sections of the labyrinth, making their depths accessible for systematic study and plunder. It was a desperate, bloody, and often fatal form of archaeology. The discovery of the Isz Chalice was the pinnacle of this entire endeavor. Isz was different from the other labyrinths, like the Pithumerian or Loran chalices, where those spoke of dead civilizations and bestial curses. Isz was alive. It was vibrant with a strange, terrible energy. The very stones in Isz seemed to glow with an internal, cosmic light. The creatures found within were not mere beasts. They were beings of a celestial nature, with forms that defied conventional biology. To descend into Isz was not to explore a tomb. It was to step into a pocket of the cosmos that had somehow brushed against, or perhaps seeped into, our own world. It was a place where the laws of physics felt thin and fragile. For the prospector who brought this chalice back to the Upper Cathedral Ward, it must have been a moment of unparalleled triumph and profound terror. When the scholars of the choir performed the ritual with the Isz Chalice and peered into its recreated depths, their world view shattered. The central, guiding principle they had inherited from Master Willem was fear the old blood. Willem believed that the key to evolution lay in insight, in the internal cultivation of eyes on the inside, and he distrusted the physical medium of the old blood, seeing it as a corrupting, beast-making agent. The choir, up to this point, had likely adhered to a more balanced approach, respecting both the blood ministration of the church and the intellectual pursuit of insight. But Isz changed everything. Within that chalice dungeon, they encountered a reality that was awash with cosmic power, a power that was not bound by Willem's cautious dichotomy. Here was a place teeming with with celestial beings, all existing in a state of profound, alien vitality, and it was all bathed in a strange, ethereal fluid that was unmistakably a form of blood. A pale, blue, celestial blood. This was the choir's great epiphany, the moment that birthed their core philosophy. They realized that Willem's warning, while perhaps prudent, was ultimately limiting. The cosmos was not a distant, abstract concept to be meditated upon. It was here. It was imminent. It was physically present, and it operated on principles that could be studied, harnessed, and even ingested. The phrase they coined after this revelation has become synonymous with their order. The sky and the cosmos are one. This was not a poetic metaphor. It was a scientific conclusion. They understood that the blue sky above Ihanam was not an empty expanse, but a thin veil, a fragile membrane separating our mundane reality from the bustling, breathing, thinking cosmos of the great ones. The stars were not distant suns. They were eyes watching, or perhaps doorways, waiting to be opened. This realization rendered the old debates between blood and insight somewhat obsolete. In the worldview of the choir, everything was connected. The same cosmic forces that granted insight also flowed through a more refined, celestial form of blood. The problem with the old blood found in the Pithumerian tombs, they likely reasoned, was that it was impure, degraded, or perhaps too potent for the unaltered human body, leading to the predictable, bestial degeneration. But the essence of it, the power within it, was the same power that illuminated the cosmos. The goal, then, was not to fear the blood, but to refine it, to understand it, and to transform the human body into a vessel capable of containing it without regression to a beastly state. They sought to create a new kind of human, one that could safely channel cosmic power and thus open its eyes to the truth. This new philosophy demanded new tools, new methods, and a new kind of relationship with the divine. The Isz Chalice had shown them the path, but it was a static recreation of a single location. They needed a living source, a direct line to the cosmos that they could consult, study, and most importantly, utilize. The discovery of Isz set them on a frantic search for a more immediate, more tangible connection. It fueled their expeditions, sharpened their focus, and gave them the confidence to believe that such a connection was not only possible, but within their grasp. They were no longer just scholars interpreting old texts. They were pioneers on the verge of a new frontier, ready to make contact. The Isz Chalice was the key that unlocked the door. It was the moment the choir stopped looking down into the tombs for answers and started looking up at the sky, not with wonder, but with the focused, analytical gaze of a surgeon preparing to make an incision. They now knew the cosmos was just on the other side of a thin, blue veil. All they needed to do was find a way to pierce it, to reach through and pull a piece of that heaven down to earth. And as we will see in our next exploration, that is precisely what they did. Their search for a living source would lead them to the most significant and tragic discovery in their history, a discovery that would define their entire legacy. Ebrietas, the left-behind daughter of the cosmos, waiting in the darkness for someone, anyone, to find her. The discovery of the Isz Chalice had given the choir a new, terrifying map of the universe. They now understood the intimate proximity of the cosmos, and they possessed a burning, scientific need to establish direct contact. Their tomb prospectors, armed with this new cosmic awareness, delved ever deeper, following trails of arcane resonance and strange geological anomalies that hinted at a presence far greater than the ghosts and kin they had previously encountered. And then, in the deepest, most lightless recesses of the labyrinth, in a chamber that felt less like a room and more like a bubble of space-time trapped between worlds, they found her. They found Ebrietas. The initial encounter must have been a moment of profound, world-shattering awe. This was not a desiccated corpse, not an inert artifact, not a mere kin. This was a living, breathing great one, a daughter of the cosmos left behind. Her form was immense, a symphony of contradictions, both beautiful and grotesque, ethereal and viscerally physical. Her pale, almost translucent flesh, her magnificent, tattered wings that seemed woven from starlight and void, her head, a bizarre and elegant structure that defied any earthly classification. And most strikingly, the pulsating, organic mass of her lower body, a reminder that even the divine in this world is bound to a kind of biology. And then there was the blood. Not the dark, thick blood of the Pithumerians, but a pale, glowing, celestial ichor that seeped from her, a fluid that seemed to be liquid insight, liquid cosmos. The term they used for her, daughter of the cosmos, is deeply significant. It implies a lineage, a connection to the vast, unknowable entities that dwell beyond the veil. But the more crucial part of her title is often overlooked. She was left behind. This single detail is the cornerstone of the entire relationship between the choir and their god. Ebrietas was not a conquering deity, not an invader, not a wrathful judge. She was a stranded being, a lonely entity separated from her kin, trapped in a reality that was not her own. Her presence in that chamber was not one of malevolent intent, but of tragic isolation. This context is everything. The choir did not conquer a god, they found a castaway. They did not capture a celestial being through force of arms, they approached a lonely, abandoned entity with the offer of communion. And commune they did. The nature of this communication is one of the great mysteries, but we can infer its methods from the tools the choir left behind. It was likely a complex, multi-layered process, combining direct psychic contact with more tangible, physical interaction. The choir, with their silk-thin heads and cultivated insight, would have been uniquely suited to perceive the psychic emanations of a great one. They may have experienced her thoughts as waves of pure concept, as geometric patterns imprinted on their minds, or as a flood of information that bypassed language entirely. This would have been the source of their most profound revelations, the raw, unfiltered data of the cosmos flowing from her mind into theirs. But the choir were scientists and surgeons as much as they were mystics. They could not rely on psychic impressions alone. They needed something more concrete, something they could measure, analyze, and replicate. This is where the physical communion began. They built an altar around her, a structure that was part laboratory, part shrine. They would have taken samples of her pale blood, that celestial ichor that was the very essence of her power. They studied it, distilled it, and experimented with its properties. It is this blood that became the basis for their most powerful arcane tools, a substance so potent that merely channeling it could unleash the fury of the stars themselves, as seen in the spell A Call Beyond. Their communion also took a more intimate form. We find another of their signature tools, the auger of Ebrietas. This device is described as a relic of the encounter with the left-behind Great One. It is not a weapon they built, but a part of the encounter itself. The auger is a physical manifestation of their connection, a tentacled, organic protrusion that they can summon to enact their will. The most compelling theory is that the auger is, in fact, a fragment of Ebrietas herself, a piece of her being that she granted to the choir, or that they somehow cultivated from her form. It functions as a direct line to her power, allowing the user to briefly channel a fraction of her strength for defense or attack. The very word augur means a prophet, a seer, one who interprets the will of the gods. The tool is both a weapon and a symbol of their role as the interpreters of Ebrietas. This relationship, however, was not one of equals. It was a symbiosis, but a deeply unbalanced one. For Ebrietas, the choir may have been a comforting presence, a voice in the silence, a means to alleviate the profound loneliness of being left behind. They were her companions, her priests, the only contact she had in the waking world. But for the choir, Ebrietas was the ultimate resource. She was a living library of cosmic knowledge, a fountain of divine blood, and a biological template for their own aspirations. They revered her, yes, but it was the reverence of a scientist for a perfect specimen. Their goal was not merely to worship her, but to understand her, to replicate her, and ultimately to use her as a bridge for humanity to cross over into the cosmos. This dynamic is the source of the profound tragedy that defines the choir. In their quest for evolution, they encountered a being of genuine pathos, a god worthy of pity. They found a divine tragedy and saw in it a laboratory opportunity. Their entire legacy, from their greatest achievements to their most horrific failures, flows from this single, foundational relationship. The Celestial Emissaries, the living failures, all of them are attempts to create something in the image of Ebrietas, to forge new kin using the materials and insights she provided. They looked upon a left-behind daughter and saw not a call for help, but a blueprint for a new humanity. They found a god, and in their ambition, they made her their subject. With Ebrietas secured as their divine wellspring of knowledge and power, the choir moved from theory to practice. The abstract concept of eyes on the inside was no longer enough. They now sought to physically rewrite the human form, to sculpt flesh and consciousness into a new shape capable of communing with the cosmos. This required a space dedicated to this grand, terrible work. That space was the Lumenflower Gardens, a place whose beautiful, serene name belies the horrific experiments that were conducted within its bounds. Here, amidst the otherworldly glow of the lumenflowers, the choir began their most direct and morally reprehensible project: the forced creation of kin. The Lumenwood Gardens, often associated with the choir's work, represent the ideal, the theoretical end goal. Lumenwood is a rare, celestial plant that seems to be a form of life already in harmony with the cosmos. The choir sought to turn humans into something similar, Lumenwood beings. But to achieve this, they needed a laboratory, a place for the messy, brutal process of trial and error. The Lumenflower Gardens served as this grim testing ground. The flowers themselves, with their soft, blue bioluminescence, were likely not just decoration. They may have served a functional purpose, perhaps emitting a specific frequency of arcane energy that stabilized the transformation process or pacified the subjects. The gardens were a controlled environment, a bioarcanic facility where the choir could play God with human lives. The primary subjects for these experiments were, tragically, the most readily available and most vulnerable population under the choir's control: the orphans. These children, raised in the orphanage and indoctrinated into the choir's worldview, were seen as the perfect candidates. Their minds were pure, untainted by the outside world, and their young bodies were perhaps more plastic, more susceptible to the radical alterations the choir wished to impose. We can only imagine the process of selection. The most intellectually promising might have been spared for roles as full choir members, the future thinkers. Those deemed less gifted are those who showed a particular physical or psychic resonance with the cosmic energy would have been chosen for a different, far more frightening destiny. They were taken to the gardens to become the raw material for the choir's grand ambition. The experiments themselves were a grotesque fusion of advanced surgery, blood ministration, and arcane ritual. The choir's goal was to trigger a specific kind of transformation, not the bestial degeneration caused by the old blood, but an ascent into kin, the state of being that belonged to the celestial entities they encountered in Isz. To do this, they needed to overwhelm the human body with insight and cosmic power, forcing the brain to develop new structures, new senses. The method is hinted at in the game's world. We see the results in the two primary types of creations that emerged from their work: the Celestial Emissaries and the Living Failures. The Celestial Emissaries are the choir's most famous, and in their eyes, perhaps their most successful creations. These small, blue, childlike creatures with enormous, bulbous heads are the end result of the transformation process applied to the orphans. Their enlarged craniums are a direct physical manifestation of the silk-thin head's philosophy. The choir was literally trying to grow a new organ of perception inside the skull, a brain complex enough to process cosmic information. The emissaries are passive, simple-minded beings. They do not attack unless provoked, and they seem to possess a childlike curiosity, pointing at the player and chattering in innocent, nonsensical sounds. This suggests that the transformation, while successful in altering their physical form, either destroyed their higher intellect or left them with the mental capacity of the children they once were. They became conduits, but not comprehending ones. They were living antennas, broadcasting and receiving cosmic signals, but unable to understand the message. The other, more horrifying result of these experiments are the living failures. Found in the research hall, which was intrinsically linked to the choir's work, these creatures represent a different, more catastrophic outcome. They are massive, malformed, and violent. Their bodies are a chaotic mess of fused limbs and distorted features, their heads sunken into their torsos. They are the testament to what happened when the transformation process went wrong. The name says it all: living failures. They are not beasts, they are kin, but their form is a botched, unstable, and painful one. They are beings trapped in a state of perpetual agony and rage, their very existence a scream of protest against the unnatural processes that created them. The fact that they are found in a garden tending to lumen flowers adds a layer of profound irony and sadness. They are failures forced to tend to the symbols of the ideal they could never achieve. The choir's work in the lumen flower gardens was a systematic, institutionalized atrocity. It was a process of breaking down human children and attempting to reassemble them as something else, something better. They viewed these orphans not as human beings with rights and futures, but as clay to be molded in the image of their cosmic aspirations. Every celestial emissary, stumbling mindlessly through the gardens, is a ghost of a stolen childhood. Every living failure, roaring in pain and lashing out with arcane power, is a monument to the choir's ruthless ambition. They sought to create a garden of celestial children, but they succeeded only in creating a graveyard of lost humanity, a place where the flowers glow with a cold, unforgiving light on the ruins of countless shattered lives. As the choir solidified its power and pursued its forbidden research in the Upper Cathedral Ward, another faction within the healing church was rising, one with a radically different methodology and an equally grand, if more brutal, ambition. This was the school of Mensis, and the philosophical and personal conflict between these two groups would tear the upper echelons of the church apart, accelerating its final, bloody collapse. The story of the choir cannot be fully told without understanding this schism. This cold war of ideologies fought in shadowy lecture halls and through proxy actions across a dying city. The fundamental difference between the choir and the school of Mensis lay in their approach to contacting the Great Ones. The choir, as we have seen, believed in a path of biological and intellectual refinement. Theirs was a philosophy of internal alteration, surgically and alchemically modifying the human body and mind to become a worthy vessel for cosmic communion. They worked with living subjects, with blood, with tissue. Theirs was a slow, precise, almost clinical method. They had Ebrietas, a physical, tangible sauce, and their experiments were aimed at creating a permanent, stable bridge to the cosmos through the elevation of humanity itself. The school of Mensis, in stark contrast, favored a path of external ritual and brute force summoning. Where the choir sought to build a receiver, Mensis sought to build a transmitter powerful enough to blast a hole in the fabric of reality and pull a great one through. Their methods were less about science and more about arcane ceremony, sacrifice, and the power of collective consciousness. They were not interested in the slow cultivation of individual insight. They sought to amass a critical mass of mental energy through horrific means. Their most infamous act, the Mensis ritual, involved the kidnapping of an entire population from Yahargul, the unseen village, and using their still-living, conscious brains as a battery to power their call into the nightmare. This is the source of the cramped caskets, the writhing, wailing sacks of fused bodies and minds that line the streets of Yahargul. For Mensis, human beings were not clay to be sculpted, but fuel to be burned. This ideological chasm bred a deep and bitter rivalry. The choir, with their intellectual elitism and their direct line to Ebrietas, would have viewed the school of Mensis as heretical barbarians. The Mensis ritual was everything the choir opposed. It was reckless, unsubtle, and showed a complete disregard for the stability of reality and the value of human life, even as a resource. From the choir's perspective, Mensis was not seeking enlightenment. They were trying to knock down the front door of the cosmos with a battering ram, with no thought for what might be waiting on the other side, or what might get out. The hostility between the two factions was not merely theoretical. It was an active espionage war. We find direct evidence of this in the person of Edgar, the choir intelligencer. An intelligencer is a formal title for a spy or an information gatherer. Edgar was a member of the choir, specifically tasked with infiltrating the realm of their rivals. We find his body in a cell in Yahar'gul, suggesting he was captured and executed by the school of Mensis. The mere existence of a dedicated choir spy within the unseen village tells us that the conflict was serious, organized, and dangerous. The choir needed to know what Mensis was planning, likely because they feared the catastrophic consequences of a successful but uncontrolled Mensis ritual. The aftermath of the Mensis ritual proved the choir's fears to be tragically correct. The ritual was, in a sense, successful. It did make contact with a Great One, specifically Murgo, the infant child of the Great One formless Edon. But the cost was absolute. The ritual did not bring a god into the waking world gently. It tore a section of the city wholesale into a nightmare realm, the nightmare of Mensis. The physical bodies of the Mensis scholars, including their leader Mikolash, were left as dead, desiccated husks in the waking world, their consciousnesses trapped forever in the hellscape they had created. The backlash of the ritual turned Yahar'gul into a twisted, petrified monument of death, overrun by the very cosmic horrors they had sought to control. For the choir, the disaster of the Mensis ritual would have been a grim validation of their own, more cautious methods. But it was a Pyrrhic victory. The healing church was now irrevocably broken. One of its two leading branches had been effectively annihilated in a single, catastrophic event. The choir was left alone in its marble tower, surrounded by the crumbling infrastructure of a faith they had helped to build. The schism had not just weakened the church. It had exposed the profound instability and self-destructive nature of the entire project of seeking communion with the Great Ones. The choir may have seen themselves as the sane, rational alternative to Mensis's madness, but in the end, they were just another group of fools staring into an abyss, their own ruin merely taking a different, slower, and more methodical form. The downfall of the choir was not a single, catastrophic event like the Mensis ritual, but a slow, creeping decay, a rot that set in from the inside out. It was the inevitable consequence of their methods, a gradual succumbing to the very forces they sought to master. To walk the halls of the Upper Cathedral Ward in the present day is to witness this decay in its most complete and poignant form. The grand architecture remains, but it is a corpse picked clean by time and its own inherent corruption. The silence is no longer the quiet of concentration, but the silence of the grave. And the inhabitants tell the entire story. Consider the fate of the choir members themselves. We do not find them transformed into beasts, for the most part. The scourge of beasthood was a disease of the blood, an affliction of the common man who received the church's ministrations without the requisite insight. The choir, with their eyes turned inward and their minds expanded, were largely immune to that particular degradation. Their fate was far more peculiar and in some ways more horrifying. They fell to a different kind of hunger. We find their bodies in quiet studies, slumped over desks, as if they simply worked themselves to death, their minds finally buckling under the weight of the cosmic knowledge they had accumulated. Others met a more active and more symbolic end. The most telling creatures that now patrol the choir's halls are the brainsuckers. These are not mere monsters. They are, in fact, the transformed remains of the choir members themselves. Their appearance is a grotesque parody of their former pursuits. Their humanoid form is still vaguely discernible, clad in the tattered remnants of choir robes, a stark reminder of what they once were. But their heads have become massive, pulsing, bulbous sacs, a physical manifestation of the silk-thin head philosophy taken to a monstrous, literal extreme. And their behavior is the most damning evidence of all. They do not seek to kill for sustenance in a conventional sense. They seek insight. They use their arcane abilities to paralyze their victims, then plunge a long, proboscis-like appendage into the victim's head, literally sucking out their accrued insight, their maddening knowledge. This is the ultimate end of the choir's quest. They became creatures defined by an insatiable craving for the very substance they spent their lives pursuing. Their transformation into brainsuckers is a perfect, tragic metaphor for their entire order. Intellect divorced from humanity, devolving into a parasitic addiction to knowledge itself. They did not become beasts of flesh and blood, but beasts of thought and insight, forever starving for more of the cosmic truths that destroyed them. But the choir's influence was not confined to their marble tower. Their legacy seeped out into the wider world of Ihanam, and then beyond into the nightmare realms. To fully understand the scope of their ambitions and their connections, we must venture into these twisted spaces. The most significant of these, and the one most directly tied to their practical experiments, is the research hall. While the hall is often associated with the healing church as a whole and the early work of Lady Maria, its purpose and its horrors align perfectly with the choir's goals in the Lumenflower Gardens. The research hall was a precursor and a sister facility to the choir's own work, a place where the limits of the human body were tested in the name of evolution. The patients there were subjected to grotesque procedures, their heads repeatedly irrigated with various tinctures in a desperate attempt to expand their minds, quite literally, by filling their skulls with fluid. The connection is undeniable. The choir's work on the Celestial Emissaries was a more refined, more successful version of this same brutal process. The living failures found on the balcony of the research hall are the ultimate testament to this shared lineage of experimental atrocity. They are the bridge between the church's early, crude attempts at ascension and the choir's more sophisticated, but equally doomed, methods. The choir's reach also extended into the forbidden labyrinths beneath the earth. We find one of their members, a man named Adela, deep within the Hypogene jail, a section of the Yahar'gul labyrinth. She is a nun of the choir, and her presence in such a dark and dangerous place speaks to the lengths they would go to for their research. She was likely there to study the effects of the environment on the human psyche, or perhaps to gather ritual materials from the tomb prospectors who operated there. Her fate, hiding in a cell and fearful of the snatchers that roam the halls, shows that even the esteemed members of the choir were not safe from the very horrors their organization had helped to unleash upon the world. Another, even more poignant figure is the lone choir member found dead in a cell in the nightmare version of Yahar'gul. This individual, who carries the Cosmic Eye Watcher badge, is a direct link to the conflict with the school of Mensis. He was likely a spy like Edgar, captured and left to die when the Mensis ritual backfired, and transformed the village into a waking nightmare. His body, alone in a cell, is a silent monument to the Cold War between the two factions, a war that ultimately had no winners. The philosophical underpinnings of the choir's work, and the reason for its ultimate failure, can be traced back to a fundamental misunderstanding of the nature of the Great Ones and the cosmos they inhabit. The choir, for all their intelligence, approached the cosmic with the mind of a surgeon and a scientist. They believed that the universe operated on principles that could be dissected, understood, and manipulated. They saw Ebrietas as a resource, a key to a lock. But the Great Ones are not mere advanced life forms. They are concepts given form, embodiments of fundamental aspects of reality. Their very existence defies conventional logic and biology. The choir's attempts to force a human connection to these entities were as misguided as trying to perform surgery on a mathematical equation. The human body and mind, no matter how refined, are simply not built to contain such truths. The process of gaining eyes on the inside is not a physiological one. It is a transcendental one that necessarily involves the dissolution of the self. The choir tried to have it both ways, to attain cosmic awareness while retaining their human identity and intellect. This was their great and fatal error. The tools they left behind are perfect examples of this misunderstanding. A call beyond is a devastatingly powerful arcane tool, said to be a recreation of the power of the star-exploding Great Ones. When used, it creates a small, contained supernova in the user's hand, launching a volley of homing cosmic projectiles. But it is also notoriously difficult to control and dangerously unpredictable. It is raw, untamed cosmic power forced into a usable form, a testament to the choir's ability to harness energy, but also to their inability to truly master it without risk. The augur of Ebrietas is even more telling. It is a direct, physical manifestation of their connection to their captive god. To use, it is to momentarily channel a fragment of Ebrietas's own being. It is a powerful weapon, but its form, a writhing, tentacled mass, is a constant, visceral reminder of the alien and fundamentally other nature of the power they wielded. It is not a clean, surgical instrument. It is a piece of a god, and using it is an act of violation, a straining of the natural order. The final, quiet tragedy of the choir is that they may have, on some level, realized their own failure. In their final days, as their members transformed into brainsuckers or simply died at their posts, surrounded by the silent, childlike celestial emissaries, they must have seen the hollow nature of their victory. They had achieved communion, but it was the communion of a parasite and its host. They had created kin, but it was a kin of stunted, simple-minded children. They had unlocked the secrets of the cosmos, only to become slaves to an addiction for those very secrets. Their grand cathedral in the sky became a mausoleum, not just for their bodies, but for their entire philosophy. They sought to lift humanity to the stars, but in the end, they only succeeded in demonstrating the immense, unbridgeable gulf that separates our world from the cosmos. The silence of the Upper Cathedral Ward is the sound of that realization, a profound and absolute quiet that speaks louder than any scream of a beast or any chant of a ritual. It is the sound of ambition meeting its absolute, final limit. As we near the conclusion of our exploration, it is worth reflecting on the choir's story not just as a historical account within the world of Ihanaam, but as a narrative with broader implications. The choir represents the ultimate end point of a certain kind of rationalism, a belief that all of existence, even the divine and the cosmic, can be broken down into component parts and reassembled to suit our purposes. They are a cautionary tale about the dangers of knowledge pursued without wisdom, of power sought without understanding, and of progress defined without morality. Their desire to transcend the human condition led them to commit the most inhumane acts, and their quest for a higher plane of existence left them trapped in a nightmare of their own making. They are a reminder that some doors once opened cannot be closed, and that some truths once seen cannot be unseen without a fundamental cost to the soul. The legacy of the choir is woven into the very fabric of Ihanaam's end. Their experiments, their rivalry with Mensis, and their ultimate decay are all integral parts of the city's death rattle. The pale blood moon that hangs low in the sky, the waking nightmare that has engulfed the world, is in part a consequence of the forces they and others like them so recklessly meddled with. They are not the sole architects of the apocalypse, but they were crucial craftsmen, building their elegant, terrible additions to the edifice of doom. And now, as we prepare to bring this long and somber tale to a close, we are left to contemplate the ruins of their ambition and the quiet, whispering echoes of their forbidden experiments that still linger in the cold, thin air of the highest ward. The story of the choir is not merely one of isolated experiments within a single tower. To truly grasp the scale of their ambition, we must understand how their influence radiated outward, touching every corner of Ihanaam's secret history, and creating ripples that would be felt long after their own silence fell. Their work created a kind of philosophical and physical architecture, a framework upon which much of the church's later endeavors were built, even those of their rivals. Consider the hunter's workshop, the original home of Jayaman and his first hunters. While this seems a world away from the choir's intellectualism, the connection is profound and direct. The hunters were, in essence, the practical enforcement arm of the choir's worldview. The beastly scourge was a messy, unfortunate side effect of the church's communion with the old blood, a regression that the choir saw as a failure of the subject, not of the science. The hunters were the cleanup crew, the necessary brutes who would cull the results of these failures, ensuring that the common populace never saw the full, horrifying cost of the church's, and by extension the choir's, ambitions. The workshop was a tool, and the choir were the hands that guided it, at least for a time. This relationship is perfectly encapsulated in the figure of Ludwig, the first church hunter. Ludwig's holy blade is a weapon of refined, almost surgical precision, a far cry from the crude saws and axes of the early hunters. It reflects a choir-influenced mindset, order, control, and a cold efficiency in dealing with the chaotic problem of beasthood. Ludwig himself, though he may not have fully understood the cosmic truths the choir pursued, was their knight-errant, his crusade against the beasts making their clean, intellectual work in the upper ward possible. This web of influence extends even to the Biogenwith College, the original source of all this forbidden knowledge. The choir saw themselves as the true heirs to Master Willem's legacy, but they believed they had transcended his limitations. Willem advocated for a passive, meditative path to insight, fearing the old blood. The choir, armed with the Isz Chalice and their captive Great One, believed they had moved beyond such caution. They saw Willem's inaction as a failure of nerve. In their eyes, they were completing his work, taking the foundational theories he was too timid to act upon and applying them with bold, decisive action. The tension between the choir and what remained of Biogenwith is a quiet, cold one. The choir, from their lofty perch, would have looked upon the decaying college and its lone, wheelchair-bound master with a mixture of pity and contempt. They were the future, Biogenwith was the past. Yet, for all their arrogance, they could never fully escape Willem's shadow. His warning, "Fear the old blood," echoes as a haunting refrain to all their accomplishments, a reminder that their entire enterprise was built upon a foundation they themselves believed was obsolete, but whose dangers they could never entirely evade. The choir's legacy is also written in the smaller, more personal tragedies scattered throughout Ihanam. Consider the story of Iosfka, or more precisely, the impostor who takes her place. This mysterious woman, who seeks to usher innocent Ihanamites into her clinic for a supposed safe haven, is conducting her own crude experiments. She injects her patients with a pale, celestial fluid, transforming them into the small, writhing celestial children, also known as the little Celestial Emissaries, that we find in the clinic backyard. The fluid she uses is almost certainly derived from Ebrietas, whether acquired directly or through some lost choir research. Her methods are a dark, twisted echo of the choir's work in the Lumenflower Gardens. She is a lone, rogue scientist, replicating their grand project on a smaller, more intimate scale, turning her clinic into a private, horrifying orphanage. Her existence proves that the choir's ideas, their methodologies, and their corrupting influence had leaked out into the world, inspiring others to continue their terrible work, even as the choir itself crumbled into dust. We must also venture into the nightmare realms to see the full, twisted fruit of the choir's philosophical seeds. The nightmare frontier and the nightmare of Mensis are not just random hellscapes. They are physical manifestations of failed communion and botched rituals. While the school of Mensis is directly responsible for the latter, the very concept of these spaces is built upon the choir's foundational belief that the cosmos is a tangible place, a layer of reality that can be accessed and interacted with. The choir's attempts to create emissaries were, in effect, attempts to build living gateways into these realms. The silver beasts that roam the nightmare frontier with their distended, star-shaped heads are a different, more bestial form of forced evolution. But the underlying principle of altering biology to access a higher plane is the same. The choir did not create these nightmares, but their intellectual framework made them possible. They provided the map that others, like Mensis, used to chart their course into oblivion. Furthermore, the nature of the Great Ones themselves, as understood by the choir, adds another layer of profound tragedy to their story. The Great Ones are sympathetic in spirit, and they often answer when called upon. The choir called, and they were answered. Ebrietas communed with them, but the nature of the answer was not what they expected. They sought power, knowledge, and evolution. What they received was a relationship with a lonely, abandoned entity, and the terrifying realization that communion with the divine does not grant mastery over it, but rather submission to its alien and incomprehensible nature. The augur of Ebrietas is not a tool they built, it is a piece of her they borrowed, a constant reminder of their subordinate position. The Celestial Emissaries do not command the cosmos, they babble incoherently at it. The choir, in their relentless pursuit of answers, found only deeper and more unsettling questions, and a silence more profound than any they had ever known. Let us also consider the physical toll of their research, not just on their subjects, but on their environment. The Upper Cathedral Ward is not just silent, it is poisoned. The very air carries a faint, blue haze, a mist that is the lingering exhalation of Ebrietas and the countless botched transformations. This is not a natural fog. It is a miasma of concentrated arcane energy and celestial biology. To breathe it for long would be to slowly saturate one's own body with the same forces the choir was experimenting with. The shattered windows throughout the ward are not merely a sign of decay. They are evidence of violent, internal eruptions. Perhaps a newly transformed emissary unleashed an uncontrolled burst of energy. Perhaps a choir member, in a moment of transformative crisis, broke through the glass in a fit of madness or pain. The environment itself became a record of the instability and danger inherent in their work. The ward was not just a laboratory. It became a contaminated site, a place where the boundaries between the human world and the cosmic world had been worn so thin that they had begun to leak into one another with disastrous consequences. In the end, the choir's story is one of sublime irony. They sought to use science and intellect to demystify the cosmos, to bring the gods down to a level where they could be dissected and understood. But in doing so, they did not conquer the mystery. They were consumed by it. Their greatest achievement, the creation of the Celestial Emissaries, resulted in beings that were, if anything, more mysterious and less comprehensible than the great ones they sought to emulate. They sought to build a bridge to the stars, but the bridge they built was one way, and it led not to enlightenment, but to a silent, lonely, and monstrous end. Their grand, marble ward, meant to be a beacon of a new age for humanity, stands instead as a chilling warning about the perils of reaching for a heaven that was never meant for human hands to hold. And as the pale blood moon hangs heavy in the sky, its cold light filtering through the broken windows of the Upper Cathedral Ward, it illuminates only the ghosts of a failed dream, and the whispering, endless silence of the choir's forbidden experiments. To truly appreciate the depth of the choir's tragedy, we must examine the individuals who comprised this elite group. They were not a monolithic entity, but a collection of some of Ihanam's most brilliant minds, each likely drawn to the upper ward for different reasons, each succumbing to its truths in their own way. We know they were selected from the orphanage, the most promising children with silk-thin heads, but what did that life entail on a day-to-day basis? Imagine the rigorous, isolating routine. Waking in a sparse, clean room high above the city, the sounds of the hunt far below merely a distant, muffled echo. Their days would have been filled with intense study, not of literature or mathematics as we know them, but of arcane geometries, the chemical composition of old blood, the psychic resonance of celestial phenomena, and the detailed anatomical records of their own failed experiments. Their teachers would have been previous generations of choir members, their voices calm and dispassionate as they explained the process of trepanation, or the method for stabilizing a subject during the infusion of pale blood. For these chosen few, the horrific was rendered mundane. The transformation of a human child into a celestial emissary was not a tragedy. It was a data point, a step in a process. This intellectual insulation, this enforced detachment from the common human experience, was a necessary part of their conditioning. To do the work they did, they could not afford to see their subjects as people. They had to see them as potential, as vessels, as stepping stones on the path to a grander existence for all of humanity. This was the great, self-justifying lie at the heart of the choir, a lie that allowed them to sleep at night in their silent marble dorms, surrounded by the faint, childlike babbling of their own creations. Consider the specific tools they developed beyond the well-known, a call beyond, and the auger. Their attire itself was a tool and a symbol. The choir garb is a masterwork of protective tailoring, woven with fine, intricate patterns said to be embedded with arcane seals. It was not merely clothing. It was a functional garment designed to shield the wearer from the insidious psychic backlash of their work, to filter the constant, low-level hum of cosmic radiation that permeated the upper ward. The white church garb, often associated with the higher echelons of the healing church, shares a clear lineage with the choir's attire, suggesting a direct line of influence or a shared origin in the church's most secretive research and development. Then there are the less obvious instruments. The choir bell, a tool that resonates with a particular frequency to heal allies, is a marvel of bioarcanic engineering. It does not use blood vials like common healing. It seems to manipulate the very fabric of life energy, a technology that could only have been developed through an intimate understanding of the life-giving or life-altering properties of celestial essence, likely derived from Ebrietas. Each of these items represents countless hours of observation, experimentation, and refinement. Each is a monument to a specific problem the choir faced and the cold, brilliant intellect they applied to solve it. We must also delve deeper into the nature of their relationship with the Great Ones, moving beyond Ebrietas to consider the broader cosmic hierarchy. The choir understood that the Great Ones were not a uniform pantheon. They were a diverse ecology of beings, each with its own nature, its own desires, and its own relationship to humanity. Ebrietas was a left-behind daughter, a tangible, physical presence. But others, like Edon, were formless, existing as a concept, a voice, a pervasive influence that operated through the medium of blood and sound. The choir's research would have had to account for these radical differences. Their attempts to create emissaries were likely aimed at communing with a broader spectrum of these entities, not just Ebrietas. A celestial emissary, in its ideal form, was meant to be a universal receiver, capable of tuning into the frequencies of multiple Great Ones, translating their ineffable will into something approaching actionable information. This explains the variety in the responses they received. Some emissaries might have babbled with the voice of a child, others might have been silent, and still others might have emitted psychic waves of pure terror or despair, depending on which aspect of the cosmos they were inadvertently channeling. The choir was not just talking to one god. They were trying to eavesdrop on an entire, bustling, alien universe, and their creations were the fragile, often broken, listening devices. This ambition connects directly to one of the most haunting and understated locations in the game, the Orphanage's back garden, where we find the key to the Upper Cathedral Ward. This is not a grand laboratory, but a quiet, overgrown space. Yet here we find the first, perhaps the most primitive of the celestial children, the small, writhing infants. This suggests that the experiments were not confined to the pristine halls of the main building. They spilled over into the very spaces where the children were meant to play and relax. The line between the orphanage as a place of care and a place of experimentation was not just blurred, it was non-existent. The entire environment was a workshop. The sandbox might have been used to test the effects of lumen flower pollen on young subjects. The garden walls might have been inscribed with faint, barely visible runes to contain accidental arcane outbursts. The very act of play could have been a cover for observation, with choir caregivers noting which children showed an unusual affinity for the strange, glowing flowers, marking them for the next round of procedures. This perversion of a place of safety into a landscape of latent horror is one of the most quietly devastating aspects of the choir's story. They corrupted the very concept of childhood, turning innocence into the raw material for transcendence. The choir's downfall, therefore, was not a sudden collapse, but a cascade of failures, each one stemming from a flaw in their initial premise. The first failure was biological. The human body, no matter how surgically altered or infused with pale blood, proved to be an inadequate vessel for cosmic consciousness. The result was either the stunted, simple-minded emissary or the violent, malformed living failure. The second failure was psychological. The choir members' own minds, for all their cultivated insight, could not withstand the constant exposure to cosmic truths. Some, like the one who became the brain of Mensis, may have achieved a horrific form of enlightenment, but it was an enlightenment that led to a perpetual state of torment, a consciousness expanded to the point of infinite suffering. Others devolved into the brainsuckers, their intellects reduced to a single, predatory instinct. The third, and perhaps most profound failure, was spiritual. They sought to build a bridge to the divine, but they approached it as engineers, not as pilgrims. In their relentless pursuit of answers, they lost the capacity for wonder, for reverence, and ultimately, for the empathy that defines the humanity they sought to elevate. Their story is the ultimate paradox. A group that dedicated its existence to achieving a higher state of being, only to lose its own humanity in the process. The silence of the Upper Cathedral Ward is the sound of that paradox resolving itself, not with a bang, but with a whimper, a slow, quiet extinguishing of the light of reason in the vast, uncaring darkness of the cosmos. The philosophical underpinnings of the choir's endeavors cannot be overstated, for their failure was as much a crisis of ideology as it was of biology. To fully grasp the magnitude of their misstep, we must examine the very nature of insight itself, a concept they believed they could control, but which ultimately controlled them. The scholars of the choir operated under the assumption that insight was a quantifiable resource, a form of data that could be accumulated, stored, and utilized, much like the blood echoes they also studied. This is evident in the behavior of the brainsuckers, who literally harvest this resource from their victims, treating profound cosmic awareness as a tangible substance to be consumed. This mechanistic view of enlightenment was their fundamental error. They failed to understand that true insight is not merely information. It is a transformative state of being, a fundamental rewiring of the soul's perception that necessarily destroys the previous self. You cannot simply add cosmic awareness to a human mind like adding a new component to a machine. The vessel itself must be utterly and irrevocably changed in the process. The choir sought the power of the cosmos while desperately trying to maintain their human identity, their scientific rigor, and their institutional structure. This was an impossibility. The cosmic truth does not accommodate the ego. It annihilates it. The serene, childlike state of the successful celestial emissaries is not a sign of their elevated understanding, but rather the opposite. It is the quiet after the storm, the simple, babbling emptiness that remains after a human consciousness has been completely overwritten by a force it could not comprehend. The emissaries did not gain eyes on the inside. They had their entire internal world scoured clean and replaced with a passive, receptive signal, a blank slate upon which the cosmos could write its indecipherable messages. The choir, in their most celebrated achievement, had not created a new form of enlightened human. They had created a living, breathing hard drive, formatted and ready to receive data, but with no operating system left to process it. This is the profound, tragic irony of their entire project. In their quest to give humanity a voice in the cosmic conversation, they succeeded only in creating the perfect, silent listeners. This misunderstanding of fundamental concepts extended to their treatment of the Great Ones, and here we must confront the most damning aspect of their legacy: their utter failure of empathy on a cosmic scale. The choir, for all their intelligence, viewed the Great Ones through a lens of pure utility. Ebrietas was not a person to them. She was a fountain of pale blood, a library of arcane knowledge, a biological template. They saw her loneliness and her abandonment not as a profound tragedy to be empathized with, but as a strategic advantage to be exploited. Her vulnerability made her accessible, and her power made her invaluable. This objectification of the divine is the ultimate expression of their hubris. They never stopped to consider what the Great Ones themselves might want or need. The note we find in the Upper Cathedral Ward, "Ascend to Edon Chapel," is typically interpreted as a simple direction, but it carries a deeper, more ominous meaning within the context of the choir's goals. Edon, the formless Great One who exists in voice and blood, was the object of their ultimate aspiration. To ascend to his chapel was to seek his audience. But what was their intention? Was it to worship, to understand? The evidence of their actions with Ebrietas suggests a far more transactional goal. They likely sought to harness Edon's formless power, to channel his influence over blood and conception for their own ends, perhaps to perfect their emissaries, or to trigger a mass ascension event. They approached the divine not as supplicants, but as technicians, believing they could interface with gods using the right tools and the correct procedures. This arrogance blinded them to the inherent dangers. The Great Ones are sympathetic in spirit, but their sympathy is not a gentle thing. It is a force of nature, as indiscriminate and potentially destructive as a hurricane responding to the low pressure that summons it. By calling out to Edon, by attempting to ascend to his level, they were not knocking on a door. They were creating a vacuum, and they had no conception of the storm that would rush in to fill it. The physical decay of the Upper Cathedral Ward is a direct manifestation of this spiritual and intellectual decay. Let us walk through it again, not as a location, but as a patient on a dissection table. The broken windows are not just evidence of violence. They are lesions, ruptures in the protective barrier between the choir's controlled environment and the raw cosmos. Each shattered pane represents a point of failure, a moment where the internal pressure of their experiments exceeded the structural integrity of their world. The infestations of lesser kin and the wandering brainsuckers are not invaders from the outside. They are a cancer, a metastasis of the choir's own corrupted essence spreading through the body of their headquarters. The grand, echoing halls are not merely empty, they are atrophied, their function having ceased long ago. The libraries are silent not because there are no readers, but because the knowledge contained within has been proven to be either useless or actively dangerous. The laboratories are still not because the work is complete, but because the workers have either become the subject of their own research or have simply given up, their spirits broken by the slow, dawning realization of their own folly. The entire ward is a corpse in the final stages of decomposition, and the faint, blue haze that hangs in the air is the ghost of its ambition, a lingering miasma of a dream that turned toxic. You can almost feel the despair soaked into the marble, the collective weight of 1,000 failed hypotheses and 1,000,000 silent screams from the orphanage below. This is not a place that was destroyed. It is a place that consumed itself from the inside out, its own grand design turning out to be a perfectly engineered mechanism for self-annihilation. Furthermore, the choir's influence created a kind of intellectual pollution that contaminated other branches of the healing church and independent researchers alike. We have already discussed the imposter Iosfka, but she is just one example. The numerous madmen found in the Chalice dungeons, often clutching precious arcane gems, are individuals who have been driven insane by a glimpse of the truths the choir sought to master. Their babbling, their erratic behavior, and their desperate hoarding of shiny stones are a distorted, pathetic reflection of the choir's own, more organized, hunger for insight. The choir, in a sense, created the template for this madness. They demonstrated that the cosmos could be studied, that its power could be harnessed, and in doing so, they inspired a generation of lesser minds to attempt the same, without the resources, the preparation, or the cold dispassion to withstand the consequences. They unleashed an idea, and that idea proved to be as virulent and corrupting as the scourge of the beast itself. The beastly scourge was a corruption of the body. The madness of insight was a corruption of the mind, and the choir were the unwitting patient zeros of this epistemological plague. Their research notes, their discarded tools, even their very methods, would have been priceless commodities on a black market of the arcane, sought after by lesser scholars and ambitious fools who saw only the power and not the price. The choir did not just fail in isolation, they failed spectacularly, and in doing so, they littered the world of Ihanam with the dangerous debris of their collapsed paradigm, debris that would continue to corrupt and madden long after they were gone. This brings us to a crucial and often overlooked aspect of the choir's work, their relationship with time and memory. The Great Ones exist outside of, or at least adjacent to, our conventional understanding of time. For a being like Ebrietas, or the entity encountered in the Isz Chalice, past, present, and future, may be a contiguous, simultaneous experience. The choir, bound by their human perception, were trying to interact with these entities using a linear cause and effect framework. This is like trying to have a conversation with an ocean by speaking a single word into a single wave. Their rituals, their experiments, their very attempts at communication were fundamentally flawed because they were operating in a dimension the Great Ones transcended. This may explain the repetitive, almost ritualistic nature of their failures. The creation of another celestial emissary, the transformation of another member into a brainsucker. These were not unique events, but rather points on a terrible, recurring loop. The choir was trapped in a cycle of their own making, forever trying to solve an equation with the wrong mathematical language. The silence of the upper ward, then, is not just the silence of death. It is the silence of a process that has run its course, a record that has reached the end of its groove and is now simply sitting in the quiet, the needle resting in a void of its own creation. They were searching for an answer in a realm where their questions had no meaning, and the only response they ever received was the slow, inexorable erosion of their own sanity, their own humanity, and finally, their very existence. They were not struck down for their hubris. They were simply left behind, mired in the linear flow of time, while the objects of their devotion moved in currents they could neither perceive nor navigate. To truly comprehend the scale of the choir's ambition, we must venture beyond the confines of their marble tower and trace the tendrils of their influence into the most unexpected corners of Ihanam's reality. Their work was not conducted in a vacuum. It created a kind of philosophical resonance that affected even those who had never heard their name. Consider the common Ihanamite, huddled in their home, fearful of the scourge. They pray to the healing church for salvation, little knowing that the very institution they trust is, in its highest echelons, run by intellectuals who view their beastly transformations as a trivial side effect, a messy but manageable byproduct of a grand cosmic experiment. The choir's dispassionate perspective trickled down, warping the church's entire approach. The hunters, for instance, were not just killing beasts. They were, from the choir's elevated viewpoint, pruning a garden, removing the unwanted growths so the more delicate, celestial flowers could have room to bloom. This chilling detachment from the human cost of the scourge is a direct reflection of the choir's own morality, or lack thereof. Their obsession with the cosmic made them indifferent to the terrestrial, and this indifference seeped into the church's bones, transforming an institution of healing into one of cold, utilitarian sacrifice. We can also see the shadow of the choir's methodology in the architecture of Ihanam itself. The city is a labyrinth of towering spires, narrow alleyways, and grand bridges, all leading upward, always upward, toward the Cathedral Ward. This is not merely a aesthetic choice. It is a physical manifestation of a collective yearning for ascension, a desire to reach a higher plane that the choir embodied and exploited. The city's design funnels its inhabitants, both literally and spiritually, toward the seat of the church's power, toward the source of the blood that promises elevation, but so often delivers only a fall. The choir, in their literal and figurative position at the highest point, were the ultimate destination of this yearning. They were the silent, unseen goal of every pilgrim who came to Ihanam seeking a miracle. They were the ones who held the keys to the next stage of human evolution, or so they believed. And the entire city was built, both physically and culturally, as a stepping stone to their doorstep. The countless souls who died in the streets during the hunt, the beasts they became, were all, in the choir's grand calculus, part of the necessary friction on the path to progress. The city itself, with its verticality and its suffering, is a monument to the choir's terrifying, overarching influence. Let us also consider the broader cosmic ecology that the choir was attempting to manipulate. The Great Ones are not isolated monarchs. They are part of a complex and alien ecosystem, with relationships, conflicts, and life cycles that are utterly incomprehensible to the human mind. The choir's focus on Ebrietas, while productive in the short term, was dangerously myopic. It was like studying a single, stranded fish to understand the entirety of oceanography. By pouring all their resources into communing with and utilizing the left-behind daughter, they remained willfully ignorant of the rest of the cosmic sea. What of the moon presence, the entity that seems to govern the hunter's dream and the cycle of the hunt? What of the amygdalae, the many-armed creatures clinging to the city's buildings, observing everything with a passive, ancient patience? The choir, in their narrow focus, failed to account for these other actors. Their attempts to ascend, to create emissaries, to pierce the veil, were all conducted under the noses of these other cosmic beings, who watched with inscrutable intent. The choir believed they were the active agents in their story, the scientists conducting the experiment. But from a wider perspective, it is just as likely they were the subjects in a much larger, more terrifying experiment conducted by forces they never even perceived. Their entire endeavor may have been nothing more than a petri dish in the laboratory of a different, even greater, intelligence. The silence that consumed them in the end could be the silence of a concluded observation, the final data point recorded before the attention of the cosmos moved on to other things. Furthermore, the very tools the choir relied upon were fundamentally untrustworthy. Arcane knowledge in the world of Ihanam is not a neutral science. It is a living, willful force that often corrupts the user. The spells and items the choir created were conduits for this volatile power. A call beyond, for instance, is not a controlled technological marvel. It is an act of faith, a prayer to the star-exploding great ones that unleashes a fragment of their power. To use it is to submit to that power, to open oneself to its chaotic, explosive nature. The augur of Ebrietas is even more direct. It is a piece of a great one, and to channel it is to allow a fragment of an alien will to operate through one's own body. The choir, in their arrogance, believed they could wield these forces as a blacksmith wields a hammer. They failed to see that every time they used a tool, the tool was also using them, imprinting a little more of its cosmic nature onto their souls, slowly eroding their humanity and replacing it with something cold, alien, and dependent. Their reliance on these artifacts was not a sign of mastery, but of a deepening addiction. They became reliant on the very forces they sought to command, and in doing so, surrendered their autonomy piece by piece, until nothing of their original human purpose remained. We must also ponder the ultimate goal, the final state of being the choir envisioned for humanity. If their experiments had been completely successful, what would have been the result? A world populated by celestial emissaries, passive and babbling, their minds wiped clean to serve as antennae for cosmic static. Or a race of beings like the choir themselves, cold, dispassionate intellectuals living in marble towers, viewing the bulk of humanity as raw material for their next project. Neither outcome resembles any recognizable form of human flourishing. Their vision of transcendence was, at its core, an extinction-level event for the human spirit. They sought to lose what made them human, their empathy, their passions, their fears, their very sense of self, in exchange for a cold, sterile existence as conduits for alien gods. This reveals the most profound tragedy of the choir. They were not heroes striving for a better world. They were, in effect, a suicide cult for the entire human race, one that preached self-annihilation in the name of an enlightenment that was, by its very nature, incompatible with the beings they were. Their forbidden experiments were not just a crime against their subjects. They were a crime against the future, an attempt to close the book on humanity before its story had even reached its most interesting chapters. The silence of the Upper Cathedral Ward is, therefore, a blessed silence. It is the sound of that terrible future failing to come to pass, the sound of a bullet dodged for all of mankind, a quiet testament to the resilience of the human spirit, even in the face of its most brilliant and self-destructive temptations. To fully grasp the totality of the choir's impact, we must consider the very substance of their power. The celestial essence, the pale blood that served as the lifeblood of their experiments. This was not the rich, crimson blood of the old healing church, the blood that promised vigor and strength, but carried within it the seed of the beastly scourge. The pale blood was something else entirely, a more refined, more volatile, and infinitely more dangerous medium. It was the physical manifestation of the cosmos, a liquid form of insight itself. To handle it, to inject it, to attempt to fuse it with human biology was the pinnacle of the choir's audacity. Imagine this substance, not as a simple fluid, but as a living, thinking material. It would have possessed a faint, internal luminescence, a soft blue-white glow that pulsed with a rhythm unlike any heartbeat, a rhythm that was perhaps syncopated with the slow, ancient turning of distant galaxies. Its viscosity would have been strange, perhaps thinner than water, yet clinging to surfaces with an unnatural tenacity, as if aware of its surroundings. The process of infusion would have been a nightmarish ballet of arcane science. The subject, likely one of the orphans from below, would be secured not with crude straps, but with bands of engraved silver designed to contain psychic backlash. The choir surgeon would not use a simple syringe, but a device of intricate brass and glass, a contraption designed to measure not just volume, but arcane resonance and tonal frequency, ensuring the pale blood was in harmony with the subject's own latent psychic signature. The injection itself would not be into a vein, but perhaps directly into the cerebral cortex, or into the newly developed organs the choir had been cultivating. The immediate effects would have been both terrifying and beautiful. The subject's veins would have begun to glow with that same soft, celestial light, a tracery of starlight spreading beneath the skin. Their eyes might have clouded over, becoming milky orbs that saw not the physical world, but the swirling currents of the astral plane. For a moment, there might have been a semblance of transcendence, a feeling of boundless connection and understanding. But then, the body would begin to rebel. The human form is not meant to be a vessel for the raw stuff of the cosmos. The transformation was not a gentle awakening, but a violent rewriting of biological code. Bones would shift and warp, the skull expanding in a painful, relentless pressure as the brain swelled with alien knowledge. Skin would thin and become translucent, revealing the glowing latticework of infused pale blood beneath. The personality, the memories, the very soul of the individual would be scoured away by the incoming tide of cosmic awareness, leaving behind the empty, babbling vessel of the celestial emissary. Each successful creation was, in truth, a funeral, the death of a human child to create a living tool. The choir, in their notes, would have recorded the physiological changes, the arcane output, the stability of the resulting form. They would have noted everything except the one data point that truly mattered, the extinguishing of a human consciousness. Beyond the physical and philosophical, we must also examine the choir's role as archivists and historians of the apocalypse. They were not only experimenters, they were also the last, best hope for recording the death throes of their own civilization. The Upper Cathedral Ward was not just a laboratory, it was a library of the end times. Its archives would have contained detailed logs of the scourge's progression, not from the perspective of the terrified citizens, but from the dispassionate view of scientists observing a fascinating pathological phenomenon. They would have chronicled the rise and fall of the Hunter workshops, the schism with the school of Mensis, the gradual thinning of the veil between worlds. Their observations would have been precise, clinical, and utterly devoid of the horror that such events should rightly inspire. In a way, they were creating the ultimate field guide to the extinction of humanity as they knew it, all while believing they were writing the first chapter of humanity's next great epoch. This dual role as both architects of the end and its historians created a profound cognitive dissonance that they resolved through further detachment. To acknowledge the suffering their work caused would be to admit their own monstrosity. It was far easier to classify suffering as transformative stress and death as catalytic failure. Their language itself became a shield against the truth, a lexicon of euphemisms that allowed them to sleep at night while the world burned below their marble tower. The silence of their archives today is therefore doubly profound. It is the silence of a failed future, but it is also the silence of a truth that was too terrible to be spoken aloud, even by those who dedicated their lives to uncovering truth. They recorded every detail of the storm, but they never once admitted they were the ones who broke the dam. Finally, we must consider the choir in the context of the other great seekers of knowledge in the world of Bloodborne, for their story is part of a larger, more tragic pattern. They were the spiritual successors to Biogenworth, but they were also contemporaries and dark mirrors to the school of Mensis and even the Pithumerians themselves. The ancient Pithumerians were a civilization that communed with the Great Ones, acting as their caretakers and guardians in the labyrinth. They too possessed great insight and power, and they too fell into ruin. The choir, in their arrogance, likely saw the Pithumerians as primitives, as an earlier, less sophisticated attempt at communion that had failed due to a lack of scientific rigor. They believed their methods were superior, that their understanding of the blood and the cosmos would allow them to succeed where the Pithumerians had failed. In this, they were tragically mistaken. They were merely repeating the same cycle of ambition, contact, and collapse, albeit with more polished instruments and a more refined vocabulary. They were the new Pithumerians, building their own labyrinth of marble and madness high above the city, just as the old Pithumerians had built theirs deep below. The school of Mensis, their rivals, chose a different path, one of brutal ritual and mass sacrifice, but their end was the same: annihilation by the very forces they sought to control. This suggests a horrifying universal law in the world of Bloodborne, that the pursuit of the cosmic, regardless of the methodology, leads inevitably to self-destruction. The Great Ones are not a destination that can be reached. They are a precipice that all who seek them eventually fall over. The choir, for all their intelligence, were merely the most elegant and systematic in their march toward the abyss. They polished their boots and composed a symphony for their journey, but they walked the same path as every other fool who dared to look too long into the sky, and they arrived at the same terrible, silent end. And so we arrive at the end of our quiet journey through the silent, marble halls of the Upper Cathedral Ward. We have walked together through the origins of the choir in the calculated charity of the Orphanage, felt the seismic shift in their understanding with the discovery of the Isz Chalice, and stood in awe and horror at their communion with the left-behind daughter of the cosmos, Ebrietas. We have witnessed the grim, methodical work in the Lumenflower Gardens, where human children were unmade and remade into stumbling, blue kin. We have observed their cold war with the school of Mensis, a conflict of ideologies that tore the healing church apart from within. And we have seen the slow, creeping decay that ultimately claimed them, transforming brilliant minds into parasitic brainsuckers, and leaving their grand citadel as a monument to a failed dream. The story of the choir is, in its entirety, a profound and resonant tragedy. It is not a tragedy of evil intent, but of magnificent ambition fatally divorced from moral grounding. They were the greatest intellects of their age, the inheritors of a legacy of discovery, and they possessed a vision for humanity that was, in its own way, breathtaking in its scope. They looked at the stars and did not simply wish upon them. They sought to bring them down to earth, to make their light a part of us. But in their relentless pursuit of this celestial future, they forgot the value of the present. They forgot the sanctity of the individual human life, viewing it as expendable fuel for their grand engine of progress. They forgot that empathy is not a weakness to be surgically removed in the pursuit of higher thought, but the very bedrock of what makes us human. In seeking to evolve humanity, they sought to erase its most defining qualities. Their legacy is not one of triumph, but of warning. It is a cautionary tale written in pale blood and etched into broken marble. It warns us that knowledge, without the tempering force of wisdom and compassion, becomes a self-consuming fire. It warns us that the pursuit of a distant, radiant future can blind us to the suffering we create in the here and now. The choir sought to open our eyes to the cosmos, but in doing so, they closed their own eyes to the world at their feet. They became so fixated on the grand design that they became indifferent to the individual threads they were so carelessly snipping. The silence that now reigns in the Upper Cathedral Ward is the final, most eloquent testament to their story. It is not a peaceful silence. It is a heavy, profound quiet, thick with the ghosts of what might have been and the echoes of what was done. It is the sound of a question that was never answered, of a bridge that led nowhere, of a door that opened only onto an abyss. It is the sound of ambition having run its course, having consumed all its available fuel, and having nothing left to do but expire. As we leave this place, as we let the images of the choirs rise and fall settle in our minds, we are left with a final, lingering thought. The cosmos is vast, beautiful, and terrifying. Its secrets are alluring, its power intoxicating. But the choir teach us that to reach for the stars, we must not lose our footing on the earth. To seek enlightenment, we must not extinguish the light of our own humanity. For in the end, the most profound mystery may not be what lies in the distant heavens, but what resides within the human heart, a territory the choir, for all their brilliance, never bothered to explore. Thank you for listening. If you've enjoyed this deep dive into the lore of Bloodborne, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel for more long stories to sleep to. Your support helps us continue to explore these vast and intricate worlds. Sleep well.